Welcome back to CEO Money. It's Ed Baxter sitting in for Michael Korba. We're talking to Cash Keahey of Keahey Consulting Group. Cash, as we were talking a second ago, we were kind of going into some things that are a little bit foreign to me, but obviously very important to corporate America as they look for different leaders going forward. Cash, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became a leadership architect.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. I have been studying leaders all my life, beginning with my father, who was a Louisiana politician. And I grew up wanting to know more about leaders and to become a leader myself, and actually fulfilled that in corporate America. And at some point, I realized I wanted to help leaders get better. And so for the last 15 years, I've been working around the world with leaders, 21 countries, 6 continents, helping them get better at leadership. But I think the beginning of it is understanding yourself. Warren Bennis said the single greatest source of leadership failure is the lack of self-awareness, that if you don't know who you are and how your mind works and what your strengths are and what your triggers are, you're going to create some collateral damage out there.
I'll probably check the box on most of those for myself, so let's just keep it real. You were a specialist in MyersBriggs type indicators. For those of us who are uninitiated, give us a kind of a high-level view on what that means.
Absolutely. The MyersBriggs type indicator, or really any typology system, is just basically trying to give some framework to the limitless variation in people out there. It is never meant, I want to start by saying, it's never meant to define, label, or limit people. It's really about your preferences. Which direction does your energy go, outward or inward? What kind of information do you pay attention to, the details or the big picture? How do you make decisions with your head or your heart? Those kinds of things. Now, people immediately say, well, I do both. Of course you do. Everyone does both all day long. But the point is, you will have a preference. One of those pairs of opposites will be the natural tendency that your mind goes. Now, over your lifetime, you'll incorporate the others, but you have a dominant preference. That's the idea.
So the idea is to identify that dominant preference?
Yeah.
What did you see as your philosophy when it comes to leadership, or your definition of leadership?
Well, my definition of leadership is moving people, and that includes yourself, in a purposeful direction. I think leadership is really about how do you get people from point A to point B. And Henry Kissinger said that. He said the challenge of leadership, the task of a leader, is get people from where they are to where they've never been. So that's how I view leadership. And I think there are 8 ways of leading, 8 very valid, very different ways of leadership.
What are they?
Well, they are. I'll begin with prudent. A prudent leader is that stabilizing, conscientious guardian, very much a presence. In my book, that would be George Washington. That was his dominant type. And then you've got proactive. Proactive is very agile, responsive, in the moment, make a decision real quick. That would be Andrew Jackson. Then you've got visionary. And here's the point. There are 4 pairs of opposites here. The exact opposite of Andrew Jackson would be a Thomas Jefferson, a very quiet, visionary prophet about where are we headed. And next would be innovating. Innovating would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal. And in fact, Roosevelt kind of set the template for a lot of presidents that followed. If you think about New Deal, there was the New Frontier with JFK. Clinton was a New Democrat. Reagan took the country on a new direction. Those kinds of things, that didn't just happen. Those words didn't just happen. They chose them because they were that type of person. Going on, we've got inclusive, Abraham Lincoln, very self-deprecating, the servant leader, persuasive, Harry Truman, very tactful, very collaborative. He always believed if he could just talk to people, he could convince them of what he needed to.
Obviously, those are all kind of, for lack of a better term, information and excerpts from the book for the most part, 8 leader types in the White House, or 8 leadership types in the White House. Why did you choose to write about the leadership types of the current presidents or past presidents?
And because so much has been written about them, there's a rich amount of material to dig into. Hundreds of books have been written about each of these. In the case of Lincoln, 1,000 or thousands of books. So there's so much we can learn from. And people ask me, why these 8? And I went back a few years to a survey that was done before rankings got very politicized. And I found that when identifying as liberals or conservatives, liberals and conservatives agreed on 9 out of the top 10 at the time, and these 8 are in those 9. So we're acknowledging that these are worthy of study, digging into and finding out how did they operate, what was their worldview, and what were the consequences of that personality type.
Based on your research, on your research there, what makes them great or even near great? What made this particular group of leaders great?
And that's a great question, Ed. The reason is consequences. What they did mattered. And there's really no argument about the top 3. People disagree maybe on the order, but George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and FDR. If you think about them, all 3 of those were during a wartime.
Who would you put first?
My personal bias would show, and I'd probably say Abraham Lincoln, just because the situation, and here's the reason. The situation was so bad when he came into office. James Buchanan, when he left office, said, "I'm the last president of the United States." So
he did indeed.
Yeah. So therein, a challenge. There were consequences. Some people have even correlated presidencies with casualties. The more casualties per capita, the higher the ranking in the order.
Well, obviously, Lincoln had his share of casualties. There's no doubt about that. Ditto that for FDR. Right. Obviously, you probably had fewer people actually go out and be casualties as far as George Washington was concerned. But in each case, you had leaders who were in a position where the country's identity and very possibility of continuing as a growing concern potentially was at risk. When you think about these presidents, as you mentioned before, and I asked you that question a minute ago. I'm going to ask it a different way now. What about recent presidents, and how do they stand out? How do they compare to some of these guys?
Well, I think they all have a personality type, and that's the first thing I'll say. And I think if you look at Barack Obama, when I try to look at objective reviews of him from like the foreign press, and they say things like he's very cool, cerebral, very much into policy. He would be like a John Adams, okay? Donald Trump, Andrew Jackson. I would say read the chapter on Andrew Jackson. You cannot help but see Donald Trump in that. So,
any others? What about the Bushes, and what about President Clinton? How do they fit in there?
Well, and I think President Clinton fit the mold of the innovating. He was trying to do things new, different, always changing, morphing. Herbert Hoover once said about FDR, he's like a chameleon on plaid. He changes his stripes or spots, whatever, to suit the situation. And I would say that is revealing about that kind of leader.
Well, we have about a minute left here. So when you think about the people that you chose to study for this book, the 8 leadership types in the White House, what did you learn? Well, we'll go ahead. We'll say that for another day. But how do people find this book? How do they find you? And how do they connect with you?
Go to my website, leadertype.com. I've got an assessment there. I've got other information about and the link to the book. The book's on Amazon. Excuse me. That's probably the best way.
We will have to cut you off there. We'll obviously broach this another time. But Ed Baxter sitting in for Michael Yorbert, CEO of Money. We thank you again for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with more great content. Thank you.